The axe handle hung in the air above her, a good 3 feet of seasoned hickory, and Winnie Ottersby did not look up at it. She was looking at the skep, the old straw dome tipped half off its board, the comb inside gone dark and sagging, and she had her bare hand flat against the grass beside it, palm down, the way you'd steady a frightened animal without touching it yet. The hum coming out of that hive was wrong, low, ragged, broken in the middle like a wheel with a spoke gone. She heard it the way another woman might hear a child crying 2 rooms off and know, without being told, whether it was hunger or a fever or only a bad dream. "You'll want to step back off my land," the man behind her said, and his voice was flat and tired and meant it, "before they're in your hair and your sleeves and you're screaming down my hill. I've seen it. I'll not have it again." "They won't," Winnie said. She did not hurry. She never hurried. She eased her palm nearer the tilted skep, close enough now to feel the small warmth breathing off the straw, and a few bees crawled out onto the board and onto the back of her scarred hand and sat there, dull and slow, their legs dusted gray. She let them. She turned her hand slow so the light caught them, and she looked at the color of them and the way they moved, and she made a soft, low sound in her throat, hardly a hum at all, more the memory of one. "You hear that?" she said, not turning around. "That's not a fighting sound. A hive that means to sting you sings high, and it sings together, like a kettle. This one's coming apart. There's no center to it." She let the bees walk off her knuckles back into the dark. "They're not angry, mister. They're starving. And there's no queen in there, or if there is, she's failing, because they've stopped tending the young. You can smell it. Sour, like milk on the turn. A right hive smells like a church that's been warm all winter." For a moment there was only the wind coming up the bench and the far-off complaint of the crows in the yellowing orchard behind them. Then, slowly, the axe handle came down. She heard the man's breath go out of him, long, as though he'd been holding it since, before she knelt. "Everybody said those bees were finished," he said. Everybody was wrong. She sat back on her heels at last and looked up at him, and the light was going gold and low the way it does at the front edge of evening, and she squinted a little against it. "There's a lot of finished things aren't." He was a lean man, weathered dark hair gone gray at the temples, and he stood there holding the axe handle down along his leg now like he'd forgotten it, like he was ashamed of it. His coat was brown and worn thin at the elbows. He had the careful stillness of a man who'd learned to hold trouble a long way off from himself so it couldn't get a grip. Behind him, up on the porch of a low gray house, a thin child stood watching, a girl of 8 or 9 with her hands wrapped around a porch post, and she did not move, and she did not speak. And Winnie marked her without seeming to and filed her away, gentle, for later. This was Thomas Reeve, and this was Reeve's Rest on the shelf of good ground they called Clearwater Bench, above the cold, reliable water of Cold Spring, though Winnie did not yet know that the water was the whole heart of the thing, and neither, then, did he. She'd come off the westbound wagons 10 days before, with her father's smoker packed in straw and a bee veil mended so many times it was more thread than netting, and she'd asked in the town below for work, any work, that had to do with bees or bloom or growing things, because that was the only work she had ever been any good at, and the only work that had ever been good to her. They'd laughed at her in the mercantile. She'd heard it plain, a big woman like that, thinking she'd salvage a man's homestead, thinking she could do a man's rough work, likely couldn't get up off her knees once she was down on them. She had let it run off her the way she let most things run off her, slow and without a change of face, because she had been laughed at in a good many towns by now and had outlived the laughter in most of them. It was old Aunt Marta who'd sent word up the hill. Marta was a widow 2 farms over with a mouth on her like a handsaw and no patience for foolishness, and she'd told Thomas Reeve straight, "There's a beekeeper come in on the wagons, a woman, and she knows her business, and you've let Ellen's bees rot 2 years because you can't bear to touch them, and you're about to lose everything for the want of touching them. 3 men had already come up to look at the salvage, and 3 men had gone back down. The place had a name in the valley now. Cursed, they said. The Reeve luck. Bees dead on the boards, orchard going off at the edges, the honey trade that had once been the sweetest in the whole valley dried up to nothing. "I'll be honest with you," Thomas said, and he set the axe handle down against the skep board like laying down a thing he was done needing. "I don't believe you can do this. I don't believe anybody can. I had 2 men from the county tell me these trees are half gone and the ground's turned against me. I only let Marta send you up because He stopped. His jaw worked. "Because I'm past the place where pride does me any good." "That's a good place to be past," Winnie said. "Not much grows in it." She got up. She got up the way she did everything, without hurry and without apology, one hand to her knee, broad-shouldered and soft-armed, and standing not much over 5 foot in her father's old boots, and she stood there in her gray work dress and her canvas apron gone stiff with old wax stains. And she looked out over the bench in the failing light, and she began, without meaning to make a show of it, to read the place. The orchard first. She could see even from here what the county men had seen. The yellowing coming in from the low edge, the blossom lying dropped in the grass under the near trees weeks before it had any business dropping, a snow of wasted white going brown. But she could see, too, what they hadn't bothered to see, because it didn't fit the story of a cursed place, that the trees at the top of the bench, up near the spring, were hale and dark and full, their leaves the deep green of a tree that's drinking well. The sickness wasn't everywhere. It came from below. It came up the hill. And a curse doesn't come up a hill in a straight line from a fence. "Your good trees are the high ones," she said. "The bad ones are down toward that far fence. Whose ground is that? Past there?" Silas Crane's. Thomas said the name the way a man says the name of a debt. He owns the big spread downslope, owns the mercantile in town too, buys the whole valley's honey and fruit. Good man, folks say. Generous. Something moved behind his eyes, and he didn't finish whatever it was. Winnie let that sit. She didn't know anything yet. She only knew the shape of the sickness was wrong for a curse and right for something else, and she was a woman who'd learned long ago to hold a wrong shape in her mind, quiet, and let it tell her over time what it was. "Show me the hives," she said. All of them, and then the water. There were 9 skeps in all, set in a rough row along the middle of the bench where the ground dipped, and that was the second wrong thing, though she only said the first of it aloud. She walked the row slow in the last of the light, and where a healthy apiary in the evening should have been all one deep contented drone, a sound you felt in your chest more than heard, this row was near silent, and what sound there came thin and scattered and grieving. 2 of the skeps were dead outright, the boards crusted with the small bodies, hundreds of them dried where they'd fallen, and Winnie crouched and looked at the dead a long while and touched one with the tip of her finger and did not say what she was thinking, which was that bees that starve die in a certain way and bees that freeze die in another way, and these had died in neither. "Ellen kept these," Thomas said behind her. "Quiet, my wife. She'd have known what to do. She always knew." His voice did a thing then, went thin at the edge like his coat, and he mastered it. "She's 2 years gone. Nobody's touched them since. I couldn't." "And now look." "I'm looking," Winnie said gently, and she left the rest alone. There was a grief on this whole bench thick as the dropped blossom, and she'd walked into the middle of it uninvited, and she knew better than to go poking at a man's grief on the first hour of an acquaintance. Grief and bees were alike that way. You came at them slow and low, and you let them get your smell before you ever put a hand in. The child had come down off the porch. Winnie saw her from the tail of her eye, drifting closer through the long grass, keeping the whole width of the row between them, watching the dead bees on the boards with a face that was half fear and half a terrible longing. Nella, Marta had said the girl's name was. Hasn't hardly spoke since her mother passed. Loves the orchard, won't go near the hives. Winnie did not look straight at her. She'd learned that too, that the surest way to send a wary thing running was to turn and look at it full. She just went on with her slow walking and let the child watch, and made her low humming sound under her breath, the same one she made for the bees, because it was the only welcome she had that didn't ask for anything back. The spring was up at the top of the bench, and here the last of the light was nearly gone, and the water came out of the rock cold and steady with a small, clean sound, and Winnie knelt and cupped her scarred hand and drank. It was good water. It was better than good, sweet and cold and without any mineral bite, the kind of never-failing spring water that in dry country was worth a king's ransom, though she thought of it then only as a beekeeper thinks of water, as one more thing the bloom and the bees would need. There was a wooden flume, a channel of split logs, meant to carry the overflow down along the orchard rows, and Winnie ran her hand along it in the dark and found where it was choked with 2 years of leaf mat and blown grit, and found, further down, a place where a section of it was clean broken through, the wood splintered pale and fresh where the rest was weathered gray. She stood a moment over that break, with her hand resting on the splintered wood. New. That break was new, but she said nothing, because it was only one more wrong-shaped thing to lay away in the quiet, and the man had troubles enough for one evening, without her handing him a mystery he couldn't do anything about in the dark. By the time they came back down, the light was gone to a deep blue, and a lamp was lit in the low gray house, and Thomas Reeve stood in the yard with his hands in his coat and looked at her like a man weighing a thing he already half knew he'd lost. "I can't pay you," he said. "Not till the honey comes in, if it ever does. There's a note against this place at the Mercantile, and it comes due at harvest, and I'm slipping toward it a little more every month. I'll be honest with you, because you were honest with me. I likely can't hold this ground, so there's no wage in it I can promise. A cot in the tack room. Meals at my table, such as they are. And a week. I'll give you a week, and if the bees are the same at the end of it as they are tonight, you'll go on down the road with my thanks and no hard feeling, and I'll do what I have to do." He said it kindly enough, but under the kindness was the flat certainty of a man who had watched 3 others try and fail, and had no reason under heaven to think the 4th, and a woman at that, and a soft one, would be any different. "A week," Winnie said, "and meals. That's a fair offer. You think a week's enough to know?" "I'll know a good deal sooner than a week," she said. "The bees'll tell me. They tell everything, if you'll hold still long enough to hear it." She looked at him steady in the lamplight, her wide calm face and her sun-freckled cheeks, and her pale hazel eyes had gone still the way they did when she was listening to something no one else could hear. "You've been told a story about this place, Mr. Reeve. That it's cursed, that it's finished, that the ground's turned. I've been on it 2 hours, and I don't believe the story. I think somebody wants you believing it, but I'll not say more than that till I know more than that, because a woman who talks ahead of what she knows is worse than a curse." Something crossed his weathered face that wasn't quite hope. He'd been done with hope too long to pick it up so quick, but was maybe the near neighbor of it. He nodded once. He showed her the tack room, a lean-to with a cot and a lantern and the good clean smell of old leather and hay, and he bid her a stiff good night, and the door of the gray house closed and the lamp in the window burned on. Winnie did not go in. She went back up the bench alone in the dark. She stood in the middle of the dying apiary with the stars coming out cold and thick over the ridge, and the broken hum of the hives came up around her, low and scattered and grieving, and she let it come. She let the whole of the place settle onto her, the water going down cold in the flume, the sweetish wrong smell that hung on the air near the low fence and nowhere else. The drifts of blossom dropped too soon, the sick trees below and the hale trees above, and the small grief of the child and the larger grief of the man, and under it all the dark broken sound of Ellen Reeve's bees dying on their boards for the want of one soul who'd hold still and listen. And standing there, alone, she named the things over to herself the way her father had taught her to name them, quiet and in order, so they'd keep till morning. 1. These bees hadn't starved, and they hadn't frozen. They'd been poisoned. She'd known it the moment she touched the dead on the board, the gray dust on their legs, the way they died reaching, the sweet wrongness on the near blossom. Something had come onto that bloom that ought not be there, and it had come onto the low rose and no others. 2. The break in the flume was fresh and clean, and no falling branch made it. The water that ought to feed this orchard had been turned aside by a hand, and lately. 3. The sickness climbed from the downslope fence from Silas Crane's good ground up toward this water, this cold, sweet, never-failing water. And a generous man who owned the store that bought your honey did not need your ground unless there was a thing on it he wanted more than he wanted to seem generous. She stood a while longer, humming low, letting the bees know she was there, that somebody was there at last. Then she pulled her faded blue kerchief a little tighter against the night chill, and she looked down the dark hill toward the far fence and the great house beyond it, where a lit window glowed small and yellow through the trees, and she said to no one, in her slow plain way, "Well, somebody down there's been busy." And she went to make up the cot, and to be ready before the light. The axe handle came to rest against Thomas Reeves' thigh, but his knuckles stayed white around the wood, and he watched her the way a man watches a snake he has decided not to kill yet. Winnie kept her palm where it was, an inch above the sun-warmed straw of the skep, feeling the low thrum come up through her hand like the pulse of something that had been running too long on too little. She did not stand quickly. She never stood quickly. She rocked back onto her heels, and the movement was so plain and unhurried that some of the danger went out of the morning without either of them naming it. "You've got a week," he said again, as if repeating it might make it a smaller thing than it was. "The tack room's dry. There's a cot." "That'll do," Winnie said. He turned and walked back toward the house with the axe handle still in his fist, and Nella watched him come from the porch, thin arms wrapped around a porch post, saying nothing, the way she said nothing about most things now. Winnie stayed out among the hives until the light went orange and then blue, and she named her 3 troubles to the deepening dark, and in the morning she was up before the birds finished their arguing, because you cannot read a place in the heat of the day. You have to catch it cold, when it's still telling the truth. She walked the whole of Clearwater Bench in that first gray hour with her boots soaking through, and she let the ground teach her. There were 11 hives, or what had been hives, old straw skeps gone soft with rot. 2 rough box things somebody had knocked together without knowing what a bee wants, and 1 good frame hive at the end of the row that Ellen Reeve must have built proper before she died, because it was the only one made by a hand that understood the creatures inside. Winnie crouched at each one and put her ear near the entrance and listened. Most gave her that thin, broken, minor hum, the sound of a colony spending itself down to nothing. But the frame hive at the end still had a note under the note, a deep round drone that meant a queen was in there somewhere, holding the whole thing together by a thread. That was the one she'd build from. You always build from the one that still wants to live. She went to the spring next, up at the head of the bench where the cold water came out of the rock, and she cupped her hand and drank and held the water in her mouth a moment before she swallowed, the way her father had taught her to taste a place, clean, sweet as slate and cold enough to ache her teeth, and running steady even now in the dry front of summer when every other seep in the country had gone to mud. She understood, kneeling there with her wet hand, why a place with a spring like this would be worth fighting over, though she did not yet have anyone to fight. She only filed it away, the way she filed everything, in the plain back room of her mind where she kept the things that didn't add up. From the spring the water ran down a wooden flume, a channel of split and hollowed logs laid end to end that some careful man had built years ago to carry the water along the high side of the orchard so it could soak down through the trees. Half of it was choked. Leaves and silt and a fallen limb had backed the water up until it spilled out early and ran off down the slope. so that the top rows of apple and the good pear got their drink, and the lower rows went thirsty and yellow. That was one of her 3 troubles, and it was the easy one, and she fixed it that same forenoon on her knees in the mud, with her sleeves shoved up over her soft freckled forearms, hauling out the black rotted leaf pack by the double handful, and prying the fallen limb loose and setting the split logs true again. When the water came through, clear and cold, and ran the whole length of the flume, and began to seep down dark into the dry rows, she sat back in the muck and watched it go, and felt about as satisfied as she ever let herself feel. Thomas found her there at noon. He'd come out expecting, she could tell, to find her gone, or crying, or stung half to death. And instead he found a broad woman sitting in the mud grinning at a ditch, and he stood a while without a word. "You cleared the flume," he said finally. It wanted clearing. Trees down low were dying of thirst with a spring not 200 yards off. Whoever let it choke wasn't paying attention. She wiped her hands on her apron, which did nothing, the apron being already past saving. Or wasn't here to. Something crossed his face at that, and she was sorry she'd said it, because she'd meant the flume and he'd hurt his dead wife, and those were different things that had briefly worn the same words. But he only nodded once and said there was bread and cold bacon in the house if she wanted it, and walked off. It was, she would understand later, the nearest thing to thanks he had left in him. The bees were the long work, and she gave them the long days. Her father had been a framing man before the frame hive was common in that country. He'd learned it out of a book and a dead Englishman's letters, and he'd taught Winnie to build the boxes and cut the shallow bars and space them the exact bee-width apart that keeps a colony from gluing everything into one solid brick. She had his tools in her trunk, his good plane, and his marking gauge. And in the evenings after the field work she set up in the tack room by lantern light and built. She robbed good pine off a collapsed shed with Thomas's grudging leave, and she measured and cut and planed, and the tack room filled up with the clean smell of shaved wood and beeswax. She was building the future the colonies would move into once she'd coaxed them back from the edge. And there is a particular contentment in that, in making a good dry house for something before it knows it needs one. The saving of the strong colony she did with more care than she gave to anything. That frame hive at the end held a queen going old and thin, but before Winnie found her she found something better. A swarm cell hung down off the bottom of one comb, a peanut of wax the workers had built to raise themselves a new mother, and inside it a fat white grub swimming in royal jelly. Ellen's bees had known they were failing, and had done the one thing bees do when they know it. They'd started making a queen. Winnie cut that comb free gentle as lifting a sleeping child, and she carried it in a wooden nucleus box she'd built for the purpose to a warmer. Sunnier stand out of the frost pocket where somebody had foolishly set the main yard, low ground, where the cold air pooled at night and chilled the brood. Up in the morning sun on the high side of the orchard the little colony took hold. She fed it thin sugar water from a wooden trough float because the poisoned country couldn't feed it yet, and she watched the capped queen cell darken and thin, and one warm afternoon a new young queen chewed her way out and stood drying her wings on the comb. And Winnie let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. She did not use a veil for most of it. The bees knew her, or she knew them, which is the same thing said from the other side. She moved slow and she hummed low, a tuneless thing under her breath that was less a song than a way of breathing, and she read the pitch of the yard the way another woman would read a face across a supper table. When a hive's note climbed and got that hot metal edge to it, she backed off and gave it time. When it dropped and rounded, she went in. She got stung, of course. A beekeeper who doesn't get stung is lying or dead. But her hands were so mapped over with old faded stings that a new one was just a warm pin, she noted, and forgot. Thomas watched her from the barn one afternoon do a full inspection of the strong hive bare-handed, lifting each frame heavy with bees up into the light and turning it and setting it back. And when she came in, he said, "Careful, like a man testing ice, you're not afraid of them. No cause to be. They're not angry. Angry bees you can feel coming a field away. She set the smoker on the step to cool. These were just hungry and leaderless. Same as anything gets mean when it's hungry and leaderless. Feed it and give it something to follow, and it settles. He looked at her a moment like she'd said something larger than she'd meant to, and maybe she had. But she was tired, and it was only the truth about bees. It was in that second week that she began to find the things that did not belong. She would not have called them anything yet. She was not a suspicious woman by nature, only an observant one. And there is a difference. But she kept finding them. The first was the smell. Down on the lowest rows, the pear and the late apple that ran along the bottom fence, where Reeves' land gave over to the big prosperous spread below, the blossom carried a wrongness under its sweetness. A faint chemical sweetish reek, like something too sugary gone sour, like the smell of the paper that comes wrapped around cheap store candy. Blossom does not smell like that. Blossom smells green and honeyed and a little of rain. She stood at the bottom fence in the early light with her nose an inch from a spray of pear bloom, and she could not put a name to what she smelt, only that it was made and not grown, and she filed it in the back room and said nothing. The second was the dead bees. There are always some dead bees. A hive throws out its dead like any household, and in a sick yard there are more. But hers were not falling evenly. Up top by the spring, where the strong colony was building, she'd find a scatter of the old and worn, natural as leaves. Down along that bottom fence, the crane fence, though she didn't yet know to call it that either, she'd find them in windrows, dozens of young foragers dead on the boards and dead in the grass, their tongues out, their bodies curled the particular way a poisoned thing curls, not the way a starved thing sags. Foragers, field bees, the ones that go out to the bloom and bring it home. They were dying with full baskets. Some of them, little pellets of pale pollen still clinged to their legs. They'd gathered something and it had killed them before they got it in. She knelt over them a long time in the wet grass, and the wide, calm face went still the way it did when she was listening to something no one else could hear. Though there was nothing to hear, only to see, and it was worse for being silent. The third was the flume. She'd cleared it clean in her first week, laid the split logs true, watched the water run the whole length. And one morning 10 days on, she came up in the gray hour and found a section of it knocked apart. 3 lengths of hollowed log heaved off their cradle and lying in the grass, the water spilling out and running to waste down the slope again, the low rows going dry a second time. She stood over it with her hands on her broad hips. A limb falling could choke a flume. A limb falling did not lift 3 heavy logs clean off their seats and set them tidy in the grass to one side. She hadn't broken it. The wind hadn't broken it. She set it right again without a word to anyone, and she filed that in the back room too, and that one she filed in a darker corner than the rest, because the smell might be the country, and the dead bees might be some blight she didn't yet understand. But a flume does not unbuild itself in the night. A flume that comes apart came apart in a pair of hands. Nella came to her sideways, the way a shy cat comes, all pretense that it isn't coming at all. The child would be in the orchard where she always was, up a low apple with her thin legs hooked over a limb, and Winnie would be 3 rows off working a hive, and neither would say anything, but each day the child was a row nearer. She was afraid of the bees. Winnie could see it in how she flinched when one droned past, how she kept the trees between herself and the yard, but she was drawn too, and the 2 feelings held her at a distance like a fish held between the pull of the line and the fear of the shore. Winnie didn't call to her or coax her. She'd learned long ago, you don't chase a wary thing, you go still and make yourself safe and let it decide. So she worked and she hummed, and she let the child watch, and when the first good honey came, a couple of frames off the recovered top hive, capped white and heavy, she cut a clean comb of it, pale gold and dripping, and set it on a saucer on the porch rail in the evening, and went to bed without a word about it. In the morning the saucer was licked clean, and Nella was sitting on the top step with the sticky edge of it still on her chin, watching the hives from a distance with something in her face that was not. That morning, only fear. She didn't speak. But when Winnie came up from the yard, the child didn't bolt inside the way she had the first week. She stayed, and she watched Winnie come, and that was a whole conversation for a girl who'd stopped having them. It was near the end of that second week that the man came up the road in a good buggy behind a good horse, and Winnie, who was on the porch at the time filling the coffee pot from the kettle, saw Thomas go stiff at the sight of him the way a dog goes stiff, not at an enemy but at a thing it can't afford to fight. Silas Crane climbed down soft and easy, a big well-fed man in a good coat with a watch chain across his front, and he came up to the porch with both hands out and a smile so wide and warm it ought to have thawed the whole yard. He clasped Thomas's hand in both of his and shook it long, and he called him neighbor twice in the first minute. And he said what a shame it was, what a downright shame, to see a good place like the rest come to such a hard pass, and how it grieved him, personally grieved him, to watch a decent man's family caught in it. Winnie poured the coffee and handed it round and made herself small and slow and invisible the way a big, quiet woman can when she chooses, and she watched him over the rim of the pot. "I'll say it plain, Tom, because we're friends and plain is kindest," Crane said, easing himself down onto the porch step like he owned it, which she supposed he half thought he did. "That note of yours comes due at harvest, and harvest on this ground, well," he spread his soft hands at the yellow lower orchard, the sorry state of it, kindly, so kindly. "I'd sooner buy it off you fair and friendly than watch the bank take it ugly and you get nothing. I'd give you a good price. Better than good. Enough to set up clean somewhere with the little girl, start over where the ground's not fighting you. No shame in it. A man knows when a place has turned against him. It was all reasonable. It was all kind, and Winnie, pouring the second cup, felt every hair on her arm stand up, because the words were warm, and the man was warm, and the smile was warm. And under all of it, plain as the chemical stink on the low bloom, was something cold and made and not grown. She could not have told you how she knew, any more than she could have told you how she knew a hive was going to swarm 3 days before it did. But she knew. A man who truly grieved for you did not smile the whole way through your ruin. And a man did not come courting a place he called dying unless he knew, better than you did, that it was worth more alive. She looked past him, while he talked, down the long slope of the bench to the big green prosperous spread below, with its full ditches and its plowed fields, and she saw how those ditches ran dry and gray at their heads, fed off no spring, and she looked back up at the cold clean water coming out of the rock at the top of the rest, running steady in a dry summer when the whole country thirsted. And something turned over quiet in the back room of her mind and began, for the first time, to add itself up. She said nothing. She filled Crane's cup to the brim, so full and slow he had to bend and sip it off the top before he could lift it, and she went back inside with the pot, and behind the window glass she watched him talk and watched Thomas listen with his jaw set and his eyes down, a proud cornered man being offered a soft way out of a trap he didn't yet know had been built around him on purpose. When Crane finally climbed back into his good buggy and lifted his hat to the house and rolled off down the road, easy as sin, Thomas stood a long while on the step with the cold coffee in his hand and did not drink it. That night Thomas told her the week was long past and she could stay on through harvest if she wanted the work, and his voice, when he said it, was rough with something he wouldn't name. Winnie thanked him plain and went out to the yard in the last light to close the hives against the cool. The strong colony hummed round, and deep and content, the note of a thing that had decided to live. She stood among them in the blue dusk, with her veil pushed back off her freckled face, and she went down the list she kept. The private list that had started with 3 troubles she could fix, and had grown, this second week, into a handful of things she could not yet explain. The maid's smell on the low bloom, the poisoned foragers dead with full baskets only along one fence, the flume that unbuilt itself in the dark, and a kind neighbor who smiled all the way through another man's ruin and wanted, more than any orchard or any hive, the one thing on this bench that never ran dry. She didn't have it yet. She only had the pieces, laid out in the dark of her mind the way she laid out frames on the bench before she built, knowing they'd go together into something, not yet seeing the shape. But she was patient. She had wintered bees and split swarms and raised queens out of dying colonies, and if there was one thing Winnie Ottersby knew in her scarred and unhurried hands, it was that you did not force a thing before its season. You watched, and you fed it, and you waited for the day the whole of it would suddenly, all at once, make sense. She banked the smoker, and she latched the last hive, and she stood a moment longer in the deepening hum, listening to something no one else on the bench could hear. The axe handle stayed lowered, but Thomas Reeve did not put it down. He stood there in the tall grass with the thing hanging from his fist, like a man who had forgotten it was there, watching Winnie ease a frame of pale new calm back into the box she had built with her own hands, and she could feel him deciding, still, whether to believe what his own eyes were showing him. "Listen," she said, not looking up, "not with your ears, with the back of your neck." He did not answer. But he listened. The hum coming off the box was different than it had been a week ago, no longer that low. Broken, ragged note that meant a colony coming apart, queenless and starving, but a steady, working, rising sound, thousands of small wings moving with one purpose. It was the sound of something that had decided to live. Winnie had heard the difference her whole life. She knew that a man who had spent 2 years telling himself these bees were as good as dead would not hear it all at once. It would come to him slow, the way warmth comes back into fingers that have been out too long in the cold, first the ache, then the feeling. "They took the queen cell," she said. "The one I saved off the old skep. She's laying now. You can see the young brood if you want, capped tight, all in a pattern, no gaps. That's a good queen." Ellen would have known her for a good queen. She had not meant to say the name. It came out of her plain, the way she said everything, and she felt him go still behind her, and for a moment she thought she had ruined the whole thing with one word. Then he set the axe handle down against the fence rail, careful, like it was something that might go off, and he crouched a little way off, keeping his distance from the box but not from her, and he looked at the comb she held out to him. The capped brood lay in it like beadwork, tight and even, honey brown against the wax. She kept a book, he said. It was the most he had offered her in 7 days. Ellen, a little book, with the dates in it. When the bloom came, when the swarms cast. I never could read her hand. He stopped. I burned it. First winter after. I didn't want the dates. That's all right, Winnie said. The bees keep the same book. It's just written in comb. She slid the frame home and closed the box gentle. They don't hold it against you. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not let himself do since Aunt Marta sent word down the valley that there was a beekeeper come off the wagons, a plus-size woman the town had laughed at, 3 men before her having turned the cursed place down, and Winnie let him look, standing there broad and unhurried in her stained apron with a strand of wheat-brown hair loose across her. Freckled cheek, and she did not shrink from it, because she had stopped shrinking from that kind of looking a long time ago. The healthy rose are blooming again, she said, to give him somewhere else to put his eyes. Come see, that's worth more than my saying so. They walked the orchard together in the long gold light, and it was true. The trees on the upslope side, the ones that drank first from the spring channel she'd cleared, had thrown out a second flush of blossom, white and pink and thick with working bees, and the yellow that had been creeping in at the leaf edges had pulled back. She had moved 4 of the hives out of the frost pocket at the low corner into the morning sun ground above the creek, and those 4 were the strongest now, roaring quiet and full when you put your palm near the entrance. Thomas walked with his hands behind his back and said nothing, but he stopped under a heavy blooming apple and stood a while with his face turned up into it, and Winnie let him have that too. The child had been following them the whole time. Winnie knew it the way she knew a lot of things, a weight at the edge of her attention, a smallness that moved when they moved and stopped when they stopped. Nella kept to the trees, thin and watchful, her dark eyes going from her father to the woman to the humming boxes and back, and every time Winnie turned her head the least bit the girl froze like a fawn. She had not spoken more than 3 words in Winnie's hearing all week. But she came. That was the thing. Every day she came a little closer to the fence line where the hives stood, drawn by the very bees she was afraid of, and every day Winnie left a small ration of the first pale honey out on the porch rail in a saucer and said nothing about it, and every day the saucer was empty by morning. "You could teach her," Winnie said low, as they came back toward the house. "If you wanted. She's got the temper for it. Still hands. Bees like still hands." Thomas's jaw worked. "She's afraid of them." "Course she is. Somebody she loved kept them, and then that person went away, and the bees stayed. That's a hard thing to sort out when you're 9. Winnie shrugged. "Easy. Fear's not the trouble. Fear you can work with. It's the ones who aren't afraid enough that get stung." He didn't answer, but that evening, when Winnie went out to close up the hives against the cool, Nella was standing at the fence, not near, but there, on the outside of it, both hands wrapped around the rail, watching the last of the foragers come in heavy-legged with the day's gold. Winnie stopped a good ways off and crouched down slow, so she was no taller than the girl. And she did not look straight at her. She looked at the bees. "That one there," she said softly, as if to herself, coming in low and slow. "See how her back legs are gold? That's pollen. She's been at the wild mustard down the creek. The lighter ones, the ones coming in fast and empty, those are the water carriers. Going for the spring." She hummed a low note, the way she did without thinking near the hives. "They all know their one job. Nobody has to tell them." The girl said nothing. But she did not run. And when Winnie rose finally and moved off toward the tack room where her cot was, she heard, very quiet, behind her in the dusk, a child's voice trying the shape of it. "The gold ones are pollen." Just that. Talking to the bees, or to herself, or to a mother 2 years in the ground. Winnie did not turn around. Some things you did not turn around for. You just carried them into the dark with you and kept them. The days built on each other the way good comb does, cell by cell. Winnie mended the section of spring flume she had found broken, the break that she had not made, the one that troubled her more than she let on, because a beaver doesn't gnaw a squared timber and a rockfall doesn't split it clean along the joint. And with the channel whole again, the orchard drank steady, and the difference showed inside a week. She patched the sagging fence on the north line. She rendered down the old dark comb into cakes of clean wax and rubbed it into the new frames so the bees would take to them faster. She built 2 more boxes from the seasoned pine stacked behind the barn, planing the joints by lamplight in the tack room until they sat true, because her father had taught her that a hive built loose lets in the cold and the moth both, and Winifred Ottersby did not build loose. And the honey came. Not much yet. It was early, the flow just turning on as the bench came into full bloom, but she took a single frame from the strongest box one morning, capped white and heavy, and she uncapped it over a basin and let it drain, and the honey ran pale as new straw, clear enough to read a newspaper through, and when she touched her finger to it and to her tongue there was nothing in it but the orchard and the wild bloom and the clean cold spring. No smoke taint, no sour, no off note. Better than anything she had tasted in the mercantile jars in town, and she had made a point of tasting those. She carried a comb of it up to the house, wrapped in clean muslin, and set it on the table without a word, and Thomas cut into it and ate a piece slow, and something moved across his weathered face that she could not name but was glad to see. "That's not a dying man's honey," he said finally. "No," Winnie agreed. "It surely is not." They took to sitting at the same table of an evening. It happened without either of them deciding it. She would come in from closing the hives, and there would be a plate set for her, plain food, biscuit and beans and sometimes a bit of salt pork, and Nella at her father's elbow, and Winnie would eat and tell them small true things about the day, which hive was queen right and which she was watching, how the second flush was setting fruit, what the weather was fixing to do, which she could read off the way the swallows flew and the ache in her stung hands. Thomas said little, as was his way, but he listened, and now and again he asked a question, and once, only once, but she marked it, he laughed, short and surprised, at something dry she said about the town men who'd told her a woman her size couldn't work a salvage. The sound seemed to startle him more than her. Nella looked up quick at her father when he did it, the way a child looks when it hears a sound it had almost forgotten. The valley noticed too, in the slow, grudging way of small places. Aunt Marta came up the wagon track one afternoon with a basket of her own eggs and a face full of opinions, and she stood at the fence and watched the boxes hum and the orchard bloom, and she said, "Well, I'll be switched," which from Marta was a benediction. Word went round the way it does that the Reeve honey was back, that the widow's bees weren't dead after all, that the fat woman off the wagons had done what 3 men wouldn't try. Some of it came back to Winnie sideways, in the little sniff of surprise from the storekeeper's wife, in the way a man tipped his hat to her on the road who a week ago would have looked through her. She did not let it turn her head. She had been underestimated too long and too thoroughly to be much moved by the turning of it. But she filed it, the way she filed everything. Because there were things that did not add up, and they were adding up faster now. The dead bees, for one. A hive throws out its dead. That was nature. That was housekeeping, and Winnie had scraped dead bees off the boards her whole life without a thought. But the dead were not even. On the 4 strong boxes she'd moved to the morning sun ground, on the upslope rows that drank the spring first, she found the ordinary few. On the 2 hives nearest the downslope fence, the fence that ran along the top of Crane's big spread, she found too many. Not a whole colony's worth, not a poisoning you could point at, but a wrongness in the numbers, a steady small dying that had no cause she could see in the bees themselves. She caught up a few of the dead in her palm one morning and turned them in the light. Their tongues were out. A bee that dies of the cold curls up. A bee that dies old just stops. A bee with its tongue run out full died, reaching for something, or died of something it drank. And the blossom on that same downslope edge, she'd noticed it first, without letting herself notice it, the way you'll walk past a wrong note in a hymn 3 times before you turn back for it. The flowers on the lowest rows, nearest Crane's line, carried a slick to them some mornings that wasn't dew. Dew beads up and dries clean. This lay flat and faintly shining, and it had a sweetness to it that was too much, too heavy, a sugar smell with something underneath it that put her in mind of the arsenic paste her father had once used on wasp galls, before he learned better. She'd rubbed a petal between her fingers, and it left a tack behind, a stickiness that clean nectar does not leave. Bees will work a sweetness. That was the whole trouble with them, and the whole use of them. They cannot help but work a sweetness, and they carry it home to the calm and feed it to the young. She had said nothing yet. She had no proof, only a beekeeper's tally of small wrongs, and she knew what her word alone was worth in that valley, the word of a plus-size woman the town had laughed at not 10 days gone. So she watched, and she counted, and she kept her own quiet book the way Ellen must have kept hers, and she moved the 2 downslope hives a good way back up the bench, away from the fence, away from the slick bloom, and told Thomas it was for the frost. Then Silas Crane came again. He came in the middle of the afternoon on a fine bay horse, dressed better than anyone in the valley had call to dress, his coat brushed and his boots soft and clean, and that wide easy smile spread across his face the whole way up the track. Winnie was at the porch drawing water when he rode in, and she stayed where she was, pump handle in her scarred hands, and watched him the way she watched a hive she wasn't sure of yet. "Reeve," he called, warm as anything, swinging down. "Thomas, I hear the most remarkable things." He clasped Thomas's hand in both of his and pumped it. "The bees, man, the whole valley's talking. I said to Fen, I said, didn't I always say Reeve's Rest had good ground under it?" He turned that smile on Winnie, taking her in, the size of her, the stained apron, the men's boots, and she watched his eyes do the sum the whole town had done and come up, as they always did, with less than the truth. And this must be the miracle worker herself. "Ma'am, just a beekeeper," Winnie said. "Modest," Crane beamed. "Modest, that's fine. That's fine." He turned back to Thomas, and his voice dropped into something confidential and kind. A neighbor's voice. A friend's. "Thomas, I won't dance around it. You know your note. You know when it falls. And I know the last year's been cruel to you. The bloom dropping, the bees, all of it, and a man alone with a girl to raise." He shook his head, all sorrow. "I've thought and thought how to help you keep your pride through it. So here's my hand on the table. Let me take the place off you. Fair price, better than fair, I'll be honest, more than the bank would blink at. And you and the girl walk away clean. No shame, no foreclosure on the county book with your name on it. You could set up neat in town. I'd see to it." He said it beautifully. Winnie had to grant him that, standing there at the pump. He said it like a gift, like a mercy, like a thing offered up from a full heart, and to a proud, cornered man, 2 years drowning in his grief, it must have sounded like the first dry ground in a long while. She saw Thomas waver. She saw his eyes go to the house where his dead wife had lived, and to the orchard she'd loved, and she saw the awful arithmetic of a father moving behind his weathered face, the note, the girl, the winter coming. But Winnie was watching Crane's eyes, and Crane's eyes had never once, through all that warm and sorrowing speech, gone to the orchard. They had not gone to the humming boxes, nor to the trees coming back into bloom, nor to the honey. They had gone twice, quick and covetous, and away again, to the low bright line of the spring channel running silver down the bench to Cold Spring, and the water that never failed. A man buying a tired homestead out of neighborly pity does not price it with his eyes on the water. "That's a kind offer," Winnie said, before Thomas could speak, and she set the full bucket down on the porch board with a small, deliberate thump that turned both men's heads. She wiped her hands slow on her apron. "Real kind. Only it'd be a shame to sell a place the same week it started paying, wouldn't it? Bloom's back on the healthy rose. Honey's coming clean and pale. Palest I've drawn in years, and I've drawn a few." "That's not a dying orchard, Mr. Crane. That's an orchard that just needed somebody to read it right." She smiled at him, plain and easy, her pale hazel eyes gone still. "But I'm only the hired help. I expect Mr. Reeve will want to see his harvest in before he decides what it's worth." There was a silence then, a long one, with the bees loud in it. Crane's smile stayed exactly where it was on his face, wide and easy, not moving at all, and that was how she knew she'd struck true. Because a real smile moves, and his sat there like a picture of a smile while behind it something cold turned over and took her measure for the first time, the fat beekeeper he'd counted for nothing, and found her, too late for his liking, to be something after all. "Well," Crane said at last, light as ever, gathering his reins. "Wise counsel. See your harvest in, Thomas, by all means." He mounted, easy and unhurried, and touched his hat brim to them both. "The offer keeps. Notes come due, though. They always do come due." And he rode back down the track toward the big house and the mercantile and the water he wanted, and did not once look at the trees. That night Thomas found her at the hives in the last light, closing the entrances down against the cool, and he stood a while before he spoke, turning his hat in his hands. "You cut him off," he said. "Nobody's spoken to Silas Crane like that in this valley in 10 years. "I didn't like his eyes," Winnie said simply, latching the last box. Thomas was quiet. Then, lo, these were Ellen's bees. It cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost. "I let them go to ruin because I thought if I kept them, and they died anyway, that'd be losing her twice. Easier to just let it all go quiet." He looked at the humming boxes, alive now, thriving, roaring soft in the dusk with a life he had given up on. Now they're back, and I don't rightly know what I feel." Winnie straightened, wiping her hands, and considered him in the failing light, this guarded, fair, grief-worn man who shouldered every blame the world handed him and half the ones it didn't. "Bees don't grieve backward," she said. "That's the thing about them I've always set store by. They don't sit in the comb mourning last year's queen. Come morning they get up and they build forward, toward the bloom, every one of them, whether it hurts or not. It's the only direction they know." She picked up her father's smoker off the fence rail. "You didn't lose her twice, Miss Reevy. You just kept the grieving going a while is all. The bees are done with it. They're building forward. Question is only whether you're of a mind to build with them." He didn't answer. But he didn't go, either, and they stood together a while in the deep blue dark with the contented hum all around them and the spring running silver down the bench, and something in his careful grief locked stillness eased by a fraction, the way frost eases when the sun finally reaches it. Somewhere behind them a light burned in the house where a motherless child was learning again the shapes of words. And Winnie stood there in the humming dark and knew, the way she knew weather off a swallow's wing, that liking a man's eyes or not liking them would not be enough much longer. The slick on the downslope bloom, the dead bees with their tongues run out. The flume split clean along its joint, the way Crane priced water and called it pity. It was all one comb now, one pattern, and she could read it. She just could not yet prove it. And a thing you cannot prove, and a valley that has already made up its mind about you, is worth about as much as a swarm with no queen. So she made up her own mind, standing there, plain and quiet the way she did everything. She would stop only watching. Come first light, she would start to prove it, every drop and every dead bee and every clean split timber. And she would do it the way she did all her work, patient and layered and true, until the pattern was writ plain enough that even the men who'd laughed at her would have to read it. She didn't let the axe handle out of her mind even after Thomas set it back against the wall, and she didn't let the wrongness on the downslope bloom out of her mind either, that faint sweetish tang she'd caught on the petals nearest Crane's fence line, the one that didn't belong to any blossom she'd ever put her nose to. So on the third morning, after Thomas had grudgingly told her she could stay past the week, Winnie went down the bench before the dew burned off, walking slow the way she always walked. Her old boots, dark to the ankle, with wet grass. Her father's smoker cold and empty in her hand, because she didn't mean to work the hives this trip. She meant to read the ground. The bench ran downhill in long soft rows, apple and pear, and a stand of plum at the low corner, and the whole slope tipped toward the fence that separated Reeves' Rest from Crane's spread below. Winnie had learned already that a bench like this drank from the top down. Cold spring came up out of the rock at the high corner, cold enough to ache your teeth, and the flume Thomas's grandfather had chiseled carried it along the contour, so every row got its share before the runoff spilled off the bottom edge and down onto Crane's flat. She'd cleared the choked channel her first week and watched the orchard drink and green up for it. But green wasn't the whole story. Green trees could still be sick, and these were. She stopped at the top row and pressed her thumbnail into a leaf. Healthy, 2 rows down. Healthy, 4 rows down. Where the slope steepened toward the fence, she found the first of it. Leaves cupped and yellowing at the margins, blossom already dropping, though the petals weren't spent. Little brown-edged flowers giving up early like they'd been told to. She crouched and turned a fallen petal over in her scarred fingers. There it was again, that sweetness. Not the clean sweet of nectar. A sweetness with something under it, something that reminded her, faintly and horribly, of the arsenical paste the town druggist sold for rats, the green-white powder folks dusted on potato bugs and were warned to keep off their hands. Winnie sat back on her heels in the wet grass and went still, the way she went still near a hive when she was listening for the thing under the sound. Bees didn't die by accident in a pattern. That was what her father used to say, turning a dead one over on his palm. A bee that dies of age drops far from home, and you never find her, and a bee that dies of hunger dies quiet in the comb. But a bee poisoned in the field flies home first and dies on the board, because the poison is slow enough to let her carry it back. And the dead bees at Reeves' Rest were all on the boards. All on the boards, and all on the hives nearest this fence, the downslope hives, the ones that foraged this poisoned bloom. The high hives she'd moved into the morning sun were clean. She'd told herself that was the sun and the split and the new queen doing their work. It was partly, but it was also this. The high bees flew north and east to clean blossom. The low bees flew down into Crane's fence line, and they were dying of what they found there. She walked the fence itself then, slow, her wide face bent to the ground, and near the corner post she found the mark she hadn't been looking for the first time, a boot heel pressed deep in the soft ground on the Reeves side of the wire, more than one set, coming and going. And none of them Thomas's narrow tread, and none of them her own broad one. Somebody had been walking this fence at night on ground too wet to walk unless you meant to. Winnie didn't say a word of it to Thomas at supper. She'd learned, in a life of being underestimated, that you didn't spend a suspicion the moment you had it. You let it draw interest. You watched. She ate her beans and her cornbread, and she said the low hives were steadying, which was true, and she said she thought the plum corner might come back yet, which she hoped was true. And across the table Thomas nodded in his careful, grief-slow way, and Nella watched Winnie's hands the whole meal, and didn't speak. But she'd taken to sitting on Winnie's side of the table now, which was its own kind of speaking. The next day Winnie went to see Aunt Marta. Marta Osgood kept a tidy place a mile down the county road, a widow of 30 years with a tongue like a paring knife and a kindness she'd have denied to your face. She'd been the one to send word up to Reeves' Rest that a beekeeper had come off the wagons, and she'd been the only soul in the valley to say to Winnie's face that she thought a stout woman with steady hands would do better by those hives than any of the 3 men who'd looked at the cursed place and walked away. She had Winnie in and set coffee down without asking, and looked at her over the rim of her own cup with those sharp old eyes. "You've got a question sitting on you," Marta said. "I can see it. Ask it before it hatches." "Cold Spring," Winnie said. "The one that comes up on the Reeve bench. Is there another like it in the valley?" Marta set her cup down. Something in her face closed a little, the way a door closes when the wind changes. "No," she said, "there is not. Not another that runs summer through, not in a dry country like this one. There's wells that go brackish come August, and there's a creek that's a memory by July, and there's the river down in the flat that half the valley fights over. But a spring that never quits, up high where it can water a whole bench by gravity and never cost a man a dime to lift it?" She shook her head. "That's the Reeve Spring. Ellen used to say it was the only wealth on that place worth the name, and she was right, though the Lord took her before she could be right about much else." "Who's tried to buy it?" Winnie asked. The old woman looked at her a long moment. "Silas Crane has been buying water in this valley for 6 years, she said finally. "Quiet, not land. Water, he'll buy a dry quarter section nobody wants if it comes with a creek right, and he'll let the house fall down and never plant a seed. He bought the Dunmore place for the creek and dried the creek up above it so it never reached anybody downstream but him. He bought old Petey Lund's well rights, and Petey didn't even know a well right was a thing you could sell separate. Folks think he's a generous man because he carries their paper at the mercantile and smiles at their children. But you go and look at who's got water in this valley now. Come a dry year, and it's Silas Crane, and it's Silas Crane, and it's Silas Crane. And the one bench he can't buy nor dry up from above, because it's above him and it never fails, is Reeves' Rest," Winnie said. "Is Reeves' Rest," said Marta, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the coffee went cold in the cups. Winnie stopped at Dr. Holloway's on the way home on a thin excuse about a salve for Nella's chapped hands, and the old physician gave her the salve and then, because she asked it plain, told her plain what arsenic did to a bee and a blossom and a man. He was a stooped, honest old creature with ink on his fingers and 40 years of the valley's dying and being born filed away behind his spectacles, and he'd no love for Crane, though he was too careful a man to say so in so many words. Paris green, he said, when she described the Swedish white residue, the yellowing leaf, the early petal drop. Or London purple. They're cousins. Arsenic and copper, or arsenic and lime. Folks dust it on the bugs, and it kills the bugs, but it kills a deal else besides, and there's them that have learned you can mix it sweet, sugar it, or set it in a sugar water and let the bees drink it themselves and carry it home to the whole hive. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which she'd learned was the thing he did when he was troubled. A blossom slicked with it looks a touch shiny in the morning, and folks call it dew and never think twice. But dew dries clean. That doesn't. Why do you ask me this, Miss Ottersby? Because, Winnie said carefully, I've got a bench full of trees that yellow at the bottom and green at the top, and dead bees only on the boards that face one man's fence. And I mean to be sure of my ground before I open my mouth. Holloway put his spectacles back on and looked at her with a new kind of attention. Be sure of it, he said. Silas Crane is a smiling man, and a smiling man with money is the hardest kind to call a thief. You'll want more than a shiny petal and a dead bee, or he'll turn it round and have the valley believing you're the one poisoning your own hives to slander your betters. He's done that trick before, with the Dunmores. Get me a sample I can test. There's a way to test it. A bit of the leaf, a bit of the water, boiled up with the right salts, and it'll tell tales a smile can't argue with. You bring it. I'll do it quiet. Winnie walked the 2 miles home in the long gold evening, with the whole shape of it settling into her like sediment settling in still water. And it was worse than she'd let herself think, and simpler, too. It wasn't a curse on Reeves' Rest, it wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't a woman's foolishness, and it wasn't even, at bottom, about honey or apples at all. It was about the water. The one thing that never failed in a country where everything failed. Crane had bought or dried up every other drop in the valley, patient as a man laying a snare, and now he wanted the high bench with the spring that fed itself, and to get it he needed the reeve note to come due with no way to pay it, and so the honey had to fail, and the orchard had to sicken, and the man who'd already buried his wife and half buried himself had to be pushed. Quiet and sweet and smiling, right off the edge of his own land. She thought about Thomas nearly selling last week, Crane on the porch with his easy talk of sparing a neighbor the shame of foreclosure. She thought about how close it had come, and how it hadn't been kindness at all, and her jaw set in a way it rarely did. That night, she didn't sleep in the tack room. She took a horse blanket and her father's cold smoker, and she went and sat in the black dark at the top of the plum corner where the flume ran along the contour, and she waited, still as a stone, the way she'd wait on a swarm to settle. The night was clear and cold and loud with crickets, and then, past midnight, not loud at all, because the crickets go quiet when a man walks. She heard him before she saw him, the flume first, the low chuckle of Cold Spring running clean where she'd cleared it, and then a scrape, a splash that didn't belong, the small dull knock of a pail set down on stone. Winnie eased up onto her knees behind the plum trunk and let her eyes do their slow work in the dark, and there at the flume, crouched over the running water with a covered pail beside him and a paddle in his hand, was a man, broad in the shoulder, working quick and unhappy the way a man works at a thing he's told himself not to think about. She knew him even in the dark by the set of him. Boyd Teller, Crane's foreman. Every hot thing in her wanted to stand up and shout him off the bench, and she didn't. She'd caught nervous hives before, hives you could set roaring with one wrong move, and she'd learned that the thing you do with something frightened and dangerous is not to lunge at it. She watched him tip a slow pour from the pail into the flume, upstream of every tree on the bench, and stir it with the paddle so it wouldn't settle, and she made herself hold still and count it. Name it, fix it in her memory so she could swear to it, the pour, the paddle, the pail he tried to keep covered, the way he stopped twice and looked back over his shoulder at nothing like a man who didn't want to be the man he was being. When he'd done and knelt to rinse the paddle, Winnie stood up out of the dark. She didn't rush him. She said, in her low plain voice, no louder than she'd speak to a bee, "That water runs down to a 9-year-old girl's wash basin, Mr. Teller." He came up off his knees so fast he near went into the flume, the pail knocking over, and his hand went to his belt, and Winnie stayed exactly where she was, wide and calm and unhurried, hands open at her sides. And something about a woman who wouldn't run made him stop with his hand still on the knife he hadn't drawn. "You," he said. His breath was ragged. "You're the beekeeper. You oughtn't be up here." "It's the man I work for's land," Winnie said. "I've got more cause to be on it at midnight than you do." She looked down at the tipped pail, at the sludge oozing out of it pale in the starlight, and she didn't need Holloway's salts to know what it was. Paris green. "Sugared, I'd guess, so the bees'll drink it and thank you for it. You've been salting the bloom, too, down along the fence. That's why my low hives die on the board and my high ones don't." She said it flat, not a question, and she watched it land on him, watched him understand that she already knew that there was nothing to bluff. Boyd Teller stood there in the ruin of his night's work, and something went out of him, some held breath he'd been holding a long time. "You don't understand," he said low. "You don't know what it's like, owing that man." "No," Winnie agreed. "I don't. I never had enough for anybody to lend me into a corner." She crouched, unhurried, and righted the pail, and looked at the little that was left in it, and then up at him. "But I've read a good many frightened things in my time, Mr. Teller, and you're the first poison I ever met that looked back over its own shoulder while it worked. A man who liked this wouldn't do that. A man who liked this would have whistled." He didn't answer. His jaw worked. In the starlight he looked less like a villain and more like exactly what Holloway had warned her a smiling man could make of an ordinary one. A fellow in debt past his neck, doing the quiet, dirty thing because the man who held his paper had asked, and telling himself each night it was only water, only sugar, only bugs. "How much do you owe him?" Winnie asked. "That's none of." He stopped, rubbed a hand hard down his face. "More'n I'll clear in 5 years," he said, bitter. "He carries it. Long as I do what he says, he carries it. I got a wife. He didn't finish that either." Winnie stood, slow, and brushed the wet off her knees, and she looked at him a long, steady moment, and then she did the thing that would matter more, later, than anything else she did that night. She let him go. "I could rouse the house," she said. "I could have Reeve down here and the Reverend and half the county by morning, and I've a witness in my own 2 eyes and the pail at your feet. And you'd hang for a hired man's chore while the man who ordered it smiled at your funeral and hired another Boyd Teller before the dirt settled." She shook her head once. "That's not how I take a thing apart. You go on home tonight. But you carry this home with you, Mr. Teller, and you sleep on it. A day's coming. And it's coming soon, when Silas Crane comes to take this bench, and every man standing near him goes down with him. Every one. And there's going to be a minute, that day, where a man gets to choose which side of the fence he wants to be found on. You think on where you want to be standing when that minute comes. You've got till then. Not a day after." He stared at her. Whatever he'd braced himself for, a shout, a shot, the sheriff, it hadn't been that. Hadn't been a stout woman in a horse blanket handing him a door instead of a rope, and it undid something in his face. He picked up his pail with the poison still in it. Because she let him. Because she wanted Crane not to know yet how much she knew. And he went off down the slope toward the fence. And at the wire he stopped and looked back at her once, and Winnie lifted her hand to him. Not a wave, just an acknowledgment. One frightened, dangerous creature to another. Then he was gone into the dark of Crane's flat. Winnie knelt at the flume and, working by feel and starlight, dammed the channel with sod and stone above the fouled stretch and broke the flow off to spill harmless down the far edge, so not a drop of tonight's poison would reach the trees or the hives or Nella's basin. In the morning she'd clear it clean again, and in the morning, first thing, before the dew burned off, She'd take Dr. Holloway his sample, a slicked petal off the low row, a dram of the fouled water she'd caught in a jar before she dammed it, and she'd get his salts to say in plain chemistry what her nose and her dead bees had been telling her for a week. She stayed out there till the sky grayed at the east ridge, sitting with her father's cold smoker across her knees, thinking it through the way she'd think through a season, what she knew now, what she could prove, what she couldn't yet, and in what order a careful woman would lay it out so that when she finally opened her mouth in front of the valley, there'd be nothing left for a smiling man to twist. What she didn't know, sitting there in the graying dark, was that down on the flat Boyd Teller would carry the pail into Crane's lamplit kitchen and stand there unable to lie well enough, and that Silas Crane, reading his foreman's face the way Winnie read a hive, would understand in an instant that the fat beekeeper he'd laughed out of his mercantile was not a joke at all, but the one obstacle between himself and the only water in the valley worth having. She didn't know that Crane's wide, easy smile would go, for the first time in years, entirely cold, or that he'd stand at his window looking up the dark slope toward Reeves' Rest and say quietly to Boyd, in a voice with no warmth left in it at all, that the note came due at harvest, and that a great many things could happen to a dry timbered orchard and a tinder homestead between now and harvest, and that it would be a shame, a real shame, if the widower's luck ran out before the paper even had to. She didn't know that yet. But when the sun came up red over the ridge and lit the bench gold and green and treacherous, Winnie Ottersby stood and stretched the night out of her wide shoulders and went down to fetch her jar and her ruined petal and carry them to the one honest doctor in the valley, moving without hurry, the way she always moved. A woman who had finally found the tree the beeline pointed to and meant to follow it all the way home. The axe never fell that night, but 3 days on it might as well have. Winnie came awake in the tack room with her hand already reaching for her father's smoker, though there was no smoke, no waking hum, only a wrongness in the dark that had pulled her up out of sleep the way a dropped pitch in the hives would. She lay still, one breath, listening. Not the bees. Something at the water, a splash where no splash belonged, then a low grunt of effort, and the flat wooden clatter of a hive box going over. She was on her feet and into her boots before she had decided to be, the gray work dress still on her from the day because she'd been too tired to shed it. Out the door into a cold that smelled of crushed clover and, under it, faint and sweetish and wrong. That same chemical sweetness she had been filing away for weeks. The moon rode thin behind cloud. Down along the fence line where the hives sat in their new morning sun row, shapes moved. She heard the slosh of a pail. She heard the spring flume knock and gurgle where someone had wrenched the board she'd fitted back into it, so the clean water spilled loose across the grass and the fouled stuff went down into the channel that fed the orchard and the drinking pans. "Hey," she called. Not loud, because loud panicked bees and men alike. Hey now, the shapes broke and ran. 2 of them, maybe 3. Dark and quick down the slope toward Crane's ground, and one of them stumbled going over the low rail and left something behind. She heard it drop, heavy and metal, into the grass. She did not chase. A woman her size did not chase men downhill in the dark and catch them, and chasing was not the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered was already going wrong behind her, in the dark, in the row of tilted boxes, where a whole colony had been knocked from its stand and lay half-spilled in the wet grass, and 40,000 bees that had been sleeping warm and clustered were now cold and broken open and furious. She heard the hum change, not the low-content drone of night, a high, ragged, rising note, the note of a colony that has lost its home and its warmth and its queen's steadying scent all at once, and does not yet know the dark is not its enemy, only knows to sting whatever moves. And down the slope, from the direction of the house, a small light bobbed. A lantern, held low and unsteady. A thin voice, high and frightened, and calling her name. Nella. Winnie's heart went to ice. "Stay there," she called. "Nella, stay on the porch, do you hear me? Don't come. Stay where you are, honey." But the child had woken to the clatter the same as she had, and had come out looking for the one grown thing on that place she'd decided to trust, and she was already off the porch and into the grass with the lantern swinging, walking straight up the slope toward Winnie's voice and toward the black boiling air above the spilled hive without any notion in the world of what she was walking into. There was no time to be gentle. Winnie ran. She ran the way her size let her run, low and heavy and fast for a short burst, straight down the row, and she got her arms around the child and turned her own broad back to the hive and folded Nella in against her belly and her apron and the canvas that still stank of smoke, and she bent herself over the girl like a woman bending over a lamp in the wind. She felt the first ones hit, little hot points of fury against her scalp where her kerchief had slipped, against the back of her neck, the back of her hands, 3, 5, a dozen, each one a bright small burn she'd felt 1,000 times and long since stopped flinching at. Her scarred hands didn't so much as jump. But Nella had never felt even one. The child screamed, a raw, tearing sound, the most sound Winnie had ever heard out of her, and jerked in her arms, and Winnie held on and walked, half carried her, backward and then sideways out of the hot cloud, down the row and out toward the clear cold air by the tack room where the bees would not follow into the dark. "I've got you," she was saying, low, steady, the same voice she used on a nervous hive. "I've got you. I've got you. We're going down out of it. Don't fight. Don't slap at them. Hold still against me. That's my girl. That's it." And all the while she was feeling the child shudder and the small hands beating at her own arms and the terrible heat of the stings blooming on Nella's neck and her cheek and one at the soft corner of her eye, and counting them, God help her, counting them the way she counted everything, because the count was going to matter. By the time she got Nella clear and down onto the tackroom cot, the door shut against the last of the maddened flyers, the child was gulping and hiccuping, and her thin face had gone a bad blotched red, and the skin was already puffing up shiny and tight along her jaw. Winnie worked fast and calm with hands that did not shake because she would not let them. She scraped the stings out sideways with the flat of her thumbnail, not pinch and pull, that squeezed more venom in, scrape and flick, the way her father had taught her before she was Nella's age. She got the kerchief off her own head and wet it in the water pitcher and laid it cool over the worst of it. She talked the whole time, low and even, though her own scalp was on fire and one eye was starting to swell from a sting at the brow. The door banged. Thomas filled it, coatless, barefoot, his graying hair wild, a horse's halter still in one fist as though he'd run from the barn. He took it in all at once, the child red and swollen and sobbing on the cot, the stings, Winnie's own puffed face, and something in him that had been holding 2 years cracked clean across. "What did you?" He didn't finish it. He crossed the little room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees by the cot and got his hands helplessly above the child, not knowing where to touch her that wouldn't hurt. "Nella, Nella, look at your papa. Look at me." "She's stung," Winnie said, plain and fast, because he needed the plain fact more than he needed comfort. "A good many. Somebody put a hive over in the night and she ran into the middle of them before I could stop her. I need you to ride for Holloway." Now Thomas, not because it's the worst, because a body her size, with this many. "We want the doctor sitting here whether she needs him or not." He looked at her, and for a moment there was nothing fair-minded in his face at all, nothing careful. There was only a father 2 years widowed, looking at his one child swollen and screaming, and the woman he'd hired against all counsel kneeling over her with bees on her hands. "Your bees," he said, and it came out of him low and ruined. "Ellen's bees. I should have burned them the day Thomas, she didn't raise her voice. Ride for the doctor." Whatever he saw in her steadiness reached him. He went. She heard the horse go out of the yard bareback, unshod on the hard track faster than a sane man rode in the dark, and she bent back over the child and got on with the work. It was a long night, and it got worse before the doctor came. Nella's breathing stayed clear. Winnie kept her ear to it, dreading the tightness, the wheeze, the swelling gone inward that killed people who'd been stung too many times, and it did not come. Thank God, it did not come. But the fever did. The child's skin went from angry red to a dry, burning heat, and she began to shiver and then to talk. Not sense. Just fretful pieces of things, calling for her mother once in a voice so small it near broke Winnie in half. Winnie sponged her and turned the wet cloth and hummed low, that same tuneless hive hum, because it was the only comfort she owned, and it was the truest thing she had. And somewhere in the black middle of the night the child stopped fighting the cloth and turned her hot face into Winnie's wax-stained apron and let herself be held. Dr. Holloway came near 2 in the morning, old and unhurried, his bag in his hand and his coat over his nightshirt, and Winnie could have wept at the sight of him. He looked the child over long and careful, listened to her chest, thumbed back her eyelids, felt along her throat, counted the stings Winnie had already scraped and marked. When he straightened up, his old face was grave, but it was not afraid, and Winnie read the difference in a heartbeat and felt her own knees go loose. "It's a deal of venom for a little body," he said quietly, so as not to wake her where she'd finally dropped, and the fever's her flesh fighting it, not her breath failing. Her breath is good. That's the whole game, the breath, and hers is good. Keep her cool. Keep water in her when she'll take it. By morning the fever ought to break, and she'll be a miserable, itching, sorry child for a week, and that's all she'll be. He looked at Winnie's own swollen brow and hands. "You took the most of them yourself, I'd guess. That's what a back's for," Winnie said. Thomas stood in the corner the whole while with his fists at his sides. When Holloway said the breath was good, Winnie saw the man's shoulders come down an inch, just an inch, and then set again hard, because the fear had nowhere to go now but into anger, and the anger had a shape, and the shape was the hives. Holloway packed his bag. "I'll look in Cumlight." At the door he paused and said, mild as milk but plain, "Someone put those bees over, you said." "Somebody did," Winnie said. The old doctor held her eye a moment. "There's a deal of that going about this valley," he said. "If a body's minded to notice," and he went out into the dark. The dark thinned toward gray. Nella slept, ragged but sleeping, her fever high but holding, not climbing. And Thomas Reeves stood in the doorway of the tack room with the coming light behind him and said the thing Winnie had been waiting for him to say since the horse first went out of the yard. "You'll want to be gone by full light." She'd known it was coming, and it landed hard all the same. She kept the wet cloth moving on the child's brow and did not look up. "I've watched everyone who ever set foot on this place to help me get hurt for it," he said, and his voice was flat and terrible and quiet. A man reading his own sentence. Ellen, then 2 years of nothing but sliding backward. Now the one child I've got left is lying there burning because I let you keep her mother's bees alive when I should have put a match to the lot. I brought you here. I brought this on her. On you. Whatever's wrong with this ground, it's mine, and I'll not have another soul bleed for it." He drew a breath that shook. "Take your father's smoker and go, Winnie, before I cost you more than a face full of stings. I'll sell to Crane in the morning and be done. At least the girl'll have a roof somewhere that isn't cursed." Winnie set the cloth in the basin. She stood up slow, because she was tired all the way through, and her face throbbed, and her heart was breaking clean in two for this fair, wrong-headed, grieving man, but she stood up. And she was steady, because steadiness was the one thing she'd always had to give. "No," she said. He blinked. "I'll not go, and you'll not sell, and I'll tell you why, and then you can throw me off if you're still minded to." She reached into the deep front pocket of her apron, the one pocked with old wax, and she took out the thing that had dropped heavy and metal into the grass when the man stumbled at the rail. The thing she'd gone back for in the dark before ever she carried Nella inside, because she'd known even then that the count would matter and the proof would matter more. She held it out flat on her scarred palm into the gray light. A pail. a small tin pail with a fitted lid, dented at the rim from its fall. And down its side, dried in a pale amber crust that caught the first light like bad honey, a run of the same sweetish, chemical, wrong-smelling stuff she'd smelled on the downslope blossom for 6 weeks and told no one. Because she hadn't yet been sure, and now she was sure. "This didn't fall out of the sky, Thomas," she said. "It fell out of a man's hand while he was running off your land in the dark. Bees don't tip their own hives over. And they surely don't sweeten your blossom with poison and foul your spring after I've cleared it twice." She turned the pail so he could see the crust, could smell it. "Your ground isn't cursed. Your ground is worth killing an orchard to steal, and somebody's been at it a good while. And tonight one of them got clumsy and left me the first honest piece of proof I've had my hands on." Thomas Reeves stared at the pail on her broad, sting-marked palm, and then at his sleeping, fevered daughter, and then at Winnie's swollen, patient, freckled face, and the gray light came up slow through the tackroom door and washed over all 3 of them. Behind them, on the cot, Nella stirred. The child's breathing had gone loose and deep, and even at last. Winnie leaned and laid the back of her free hand against the small forehead, and where an hour ago it had burned, now it was only warm, only damp, the fever broken and running off her like the first clean water down a cleared flume. "Fever's turned," Winnie said quietly. "She'll do." She closed her fingers around the pail. "And so will I, because I know now, Thomas, not guess, know. I know who's doing this to you, and I know why he wants this bench and not another, and I know how it's being done." She met his eyes over his daughter's sleeping head. "What I don't have yet is the way to catch him with it in front of witnesses so it sticks. But I will. The bees'll help me. They always know their way back to where the sweet came from." Outside, in the wrecked row along the fence, the scattered colony had begun to gather itself in the first warmth, the ragged, furious note of the night sinking, cluster by cluster, back toward the low and ordered hum of a hive that means to go on living. Thomas Harlan Reeve stood in his own doorway with the axe handle nowhere in his hands, and for the first time in 2 years he did not tell the bees to die. The axe was already up when Boyd Teller heard the click of the smoker's bellows behind him. He turned in the dark with the covered pail still in his hand, and there was Winnie Ottersby sitting on an upturned crate not 10 feet off, calm as a woman, waiting for bread to rise. The little tin smoker breathing a slow curl of pine needle smoke into the cold air between them. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't run for Thomas. She'd simply been there, the way she was always there, patient in the places nobody thought to look. "You'll want to set that down," she said, "before you spill it on your own boots. Whatever's in it, it's already killed enough." Boyd's throat worked. "You don't know what I'm doing here." "I know exactly what you're doing here." She said it without heat, the way she'd tell a man it was going to rain. "You've been salting the downslope bloom with something sweet and wrong, and pouring the rest into the flume where the water comes onto the bench. Bees find the sweet, carry it home, and die in their own calm. I've been reading the count for 3 weeks. It's always the crane-side rows, never the far ones. Water carries it in, wind can't. So it's you, or a man like you, on foot, at night, with a pail." She tipped her chin at the thing in his hand. That pail. He stood there a long moment, and the fight went out of his shoulders the way it goes out of a hive at dusk. She watched it happen and did not gloat. This was the part she'd been waiting for, not the catching. The catching was easy, but the moment a cornered thing decides whether it's cornered by an enemy or by the truth. "He'll have my hide," Boyd said finally. "Lo, I owe him. Store account, then the doctor for my Mary when the baby came sideways. He carried the note, and now he owns me the way he owns everybody who ever borrowed from that counter." He looked at the pail like he'd only just seen it. "I didn't sign on to poison anything. I told myself it was just weed killer, just clearing brush." "You knew," Winnie said gently. A man knows the difference between clearing brush and pouring sweet into a bee's water. But knowing you were wrong is the first honest thing you've done on this bench, so I'll take it." She stood, and the crate scraped, and she didn't come toward him, only picked up her smoker. "Here's what I'm offering you, Boyd Teller, and I'll only offer it the once. You can keep carrying that pail till the note comes due, and Reeves rest his Cranes, and then find out what a man like Crane does with a foreman who knows too much. Or you can stand in front of the land agent when he comes and tell the truth of it, and I'll see that the debt Crane holds over you turns into the thing that hangs him instead of you." "And what happens to me after?" "You get to look your Mary in the eye," she said. "That's the whole of what I can promise. But it's more than you've got now." He set the pail down in the grass, careful, like it might wake. Then he crouched and stayed crouched, his big hands hanging between his knees, and Winnie let him have the quiet. Somewhere behind them a single hive muttered in its sleep and settled again. "There's a barrel," Boyd said at last to the ground. "Behind the mercantile back of the feed room where Crane keeps the good stock. Same suite, same color. He mixes it himself and sends me out with it in a pail. If a man had that barrel and this pail and made them stand side by side," he stopped. "They'd be the same thing." "They would," Winnie agreed softly. That's the point of it. She did not sleep that night, and she did not waste the wakefulness. By the time the sky went gray over the eastern ridge, she had the pail sealed and set aside where the barn cats couldn't tip it, and a plan laid out in her head as neat as frames in a box. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was a kind of tool if you knew how to hold it. A woman nobody watched could gather a whole case while the watchers laughed. So she gathered. She went first to Dr. Holloway, because a thing was only proof if an honest man would swear to it. She found the old physician at his breakfast and set the sealed pail on his table beside the sugar bowl, and told him plainly what it was and where it came from, and asked him to test the sweet against a dead bee from the Crane side rows. Holloway put on his spectacles and dipped and sniffed and frowned, and dipped again, and when he straightened his mouth, had gone tight. "Arsenical," he said. "Sweetened Paris green, or near enough the same poison a careless orchardist sprays for coddling moth, except no careful man puts it where bees drink, mixed with sugar water, deliberate, so the bees would take it home like a gift." He looked at her over the spectacles. "You're telling me somebody fed this to Ellen Reeves' hives on purpose." "I'm telling you," Winnie said. "And I'll want you to be willing to say it to the county land agent's face, with your name on it." "Young woman," Holloway said, "I've watched Silas Crane smile at funerals for 30 years and known there was a ledger behind the smile. You bring me where to stand, and I'll stand there." From Holloway she went to Aunt Marta, who had sent her here in the first place, and who knew every water right and grudge on the bench going back 40 years, and she sat at the old widow's table and let Marta talk while she pieced the last of it together. It was Marta who filled in the shape Winnie had only guessed at from the ground. That cold spring above the bench was the one water on the whole valley that had never once gone dry, not in the drought year of '77, when the creeks turned to cracked mud and men hauled water in barrels from 12 miles off. That Crane had spent 10 quiet years buying up water rights the way a boy collects marbles, one failing farm at a time, until every other spring and ditch in the valley ran, in dry years, at his say-so. All but this one, all but Reeves Rest. "He don't want the honey," Marta said, and spat neatly into the stove. "He don't want the trees, he wants the water under 'em, so that in the next dry year he's the only man in the valley with a full ditch, and every farmer for miles has to buy their crop's life from him at whatever price he cares to name. The honey business failing was just his lever. Underpay Reeve at the counter, spread word around town the man's honey's gone bad, so nobody else will buy it, and then when the money's tight and the note's near due, starve the bees so the last of it fails, and buy the whole thing for the price of the debt. Kind old Silas saving a poor widower from foreclosure. He'd have folks thanking him for it. Winnie turned her coffee cup slow in her scarred hands and felt the whole design settle into place, clean and cold and complete. She had suspected most of it. Hearing it said aloud only sharpened the one thing she meant to do with it. "Marta," she said, "would you stand up in front of the valley and say what you just told me?" The old woman's eyes glittered. "I've been waiting 30 years for somebody to give me a reason to. You just did." But suspicion and testimony, Winnie knew, were not the same as a thing a man could not talk his way out of. Crane was smooth. Crane had a wide, easy smile and a reputation for charity and a land agent he believed he'd bought. And a smooth man with a poison barrel could always claim the barrel was orchard spray for his own trees, honestly kept, and that whatever Boyd Teller said was the lie of a man in debt trying to save his own skin. She needed the one thing no smile could argue with. She needed the bees to say it themselves. So on the third morning she did the thing her father had taught her by lamplight when she was a girl too young to hold the frames. She went hunting a beeline. She took a shallow dish of clean honey out to the healthy far rows first and set it on a flat stone in the sun and waited until the foragers found it. When a bee settled to feed, she caught it gentle under a bit of gauze, touched a dab of flour to its fuzzy back with a wet twig so it wore a little cap of white, and let it go. Then she sat back on her heels with her father's watch open in her palm and marked the minutes. A honeybee flies a known distance and comes home, feed her, and she'll fetch her sisters. Watch which way the loaded ones aim and how long they're gone, and you can read the road to the flower the way a tracker reads a bent grass stem. It was old craft, patient craft, the kind of thing the men in town would have said no fat woman off a wagon could possibly know. She smiled a little at that, and marked her bees, and read the sky. The flowered foragers from the clean rows flew the honest way, up toward the blossoming heart of the orchard where the good bloom was, and came back in the time a healthy round should take, and that told her what a well hive looked like. Then she walked down to the sick crane's side rows and did it all again, dabbing flour on the bees that were working the slick, wrong-smelling bloom nearest the fence, and those bees, when she loosed them, did not fly up into the orchard. They dropped low and made straight downslope over the fence line toward Crane's ground and were gone longer than any honest forage, and came back. The few that came back, slow and heavy and wrong. She marked it 3 days running, in a little book, in her plain square hand. The time, the weather, the direction, the count of the ones that never came home at all. The bees drew Crane a map of his own crime and never knew they'd done it. A line as straight as string running from the poisoned bloom over the fence to the source of the sweet, and Winnie only had to follow where they pointed. Where they pointed was the back of the mercantile, behind the feed room. A barrel. She did not touch it herself. She was careful about that, careful as her father setting a frame. A thing she took in the night was a thing Crane could say she'd planted. A thing witnessed in daylight by honest men was a thing that stood. So she waited, and she gathered her witnesses, and she chose her hour. And her hour, as it happened, chose itself, because word came up the bench that Silas Crane meant to ride out to Reeves' Rest at week's end with Josiah Fenn, the land agent, at his side, and the foreclosure papers ready to file the moment the note fell due. Thomas found her at the hives the evening before, in the long gold light, and stood a while at the edge of the yard the way he did now, closer than he used to, still careful. He'd stopped expecting her to fail. She'd felt the change come over him slow across the season, like the ground warming, and had been careful not to name it aloud and startle it off. "He's coming tomorrow," Thomas said. "Crane and Fenn. The note's due Friday, and I can't meet it. Winnie, the mercantile still won't take my honey, says it's fouled, and every buyer in the county's heard him say it, so there's no cash and no way to get any before Friday." His jaw worked. "I've spent 2 years watching this place die and telling myself it was fate. Ellen's bees, dying, I thought it was grief. I thought the land was just grieving her along with me." He looked at his own hands. "You're going to tell me it wasn't fate at all?" It wasn't grief, and it wasn't fate, Winnie said. It was a man with a barrel and a plan, and I can prove every inch of it. Thomas, look at me. He did. Don't sign anything tomorrow. Not one line. Let him come. Let him bring Fen and the papers and the smile, and let me stand in your yard when he does. He'll ruin us in front of the whole valley. He'll try. She wiped her hands slow on her wax-stained apron, and there was something in her wide, calm face that made him go still. The way she went still when she was listening to a hive nobody else could hear. I've spent my whole life being the one folks looked past. The fat woman, the quiet one, the one who couldn't possibly. Silas Crane looked right past me the first day, pouring his coffee, and he's looked past me every day since. That's the thing he got wrong, Thomas. He built a scheme so clever no man could catch it, and then he let a woman he didn't bother to watch stand in the kitchen and count his bees dying, row by row, and write it all down. She almost smiled. I know who's doing this, and I know how, and by tomorrow, noon so will every honest soul on Clearwater Bench. Trust me, the one more day. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then Thomas Reeve, who spoke little and trusted slower, reached out and set one weathered hand over her scarred one where it rested on the hive board, just for a breath, rough and brief and certain, and said, "Lo." These were Ellen's bees. If you can make them mean something again instead of just a thing I let die, he stopped, and cleared his throat, and took his hand back. One more day, she said, and did not let him see how the warmth of it went all the way through her. That night she went down the bench a last time to be sure of her pieces. She found Boyd where she'd told him to wait, by the broken flume, and he was pale in the starlight, but he stayed, which was its own kind of answer. "You still willing to stand up and say it?" she asked him, and he said, "I told Mary tonight. Told her everything. She said if I didn't do right by it, she'd not have me back in the house." He gave a rough laugh that shook a little. "So I reckon I've got no choice but to be honest, on account of my wife's meaner than Crane." Winnie laughed too, quiet in the dark, and clapped his big shoulder once. "That's the best reason there is," she said. "Tomorrow, then, when he comes to file, you come up the road behind him. Don't say a word till I call your name, then say what you did, and where the barrel is, and let the honest men look." He sent Reverend Price word by Marta's grandson to be at Reeves' Rest by mid-morning for a matter of justice the valley ought to witness, and she asked Dr. Holloway to bring the sealed pail and his written finding and his willingness to swear. She had the dead bees in a folded paper, sorted by row. She had her little book with the bee lines marked, 3 days of them, the arrow of the poisoned foragers pointing straight over the fence. She had Marta's 40 years of water rights and Boyd's confession, and the map the bees had drawn. What she did not yet have, and meant to get, was the barrel itself, standing in the daylight for honest eyes to see beside Boyd's pail. The same sweet, the same color, the two of them side by side so that no smile on earth could argue they were different things. So before first light she woke and dressed in the cold, and pinned the faded blue kerchief over her wheat-brown hair with the few strands already working loose, and took up her father's smoker, out of habit, though there be no bees to gentle where she was going. She stood a moment at the edge of the humming-yard in the gray. The near hive was strong now, loud with the deep contented roar of a colony that had come all the way back from the edge of death, and the sound of it steadied her the way it always had. Everything wrong on this bench she had learned to hear in the pitch of that hum going thin, everything right she could hear in it now going full and low and sure. Then Nella came out onto the porch in her nightdress, thin and watchful, her bare feet on the coal boards, and said, clear, unafraid, in the voice that had come back to her a little more each week among the bees, "Are you going to catch him today, Winnie?" Winnie turned. The child had asked it plain, the way you'd ask if the eggs were ready, and there was no fear in it at all, only a fierce small trust that undid something in Winnie's chest. "I'm going to try, chick," she said. "You'll do it," Nella said, with 9-year-old certainty, and hugged her own thin arms in the cold. "You always know what's wrong before anybody. You knew about the bees when Papa was going to break them all. You'll know about the man, too." And Winnie Ottersby, who had come off a westbound wagon with a mended veil and her dead father's smoker and no place in all the world to belong, stood in the humming gray dawn of Reeves' Rest and felt the last piece of her own resolve lock into place, not for the wage, and not even for the land, but for the child on the porch and the guarded man behind her and the low, sweet roar of Ellen's bees. Come back to life under her hands. Down the bench, the road that led to the Mercantile lay pale and empty in the early light, waiting for the hour Crane would come up it smiling with his papers, not knowing that the woman he'd never once bothered to watch had already read him the way she read the weather, and the soil, and the temper of a dying hive, and had spent the whole quiet season, while he counted his cleverness, building the thing that would bring him down. She hitched her apron, took up the pail Boyd had left her for evidence, and started down toward the Mercantile in the growing light to fetch the last piece before the sun was full up. The axe handle had been raised over her once, at the very start, and now it was Thomas Reeves' hand that steadied hers as they carried the last full super down from the top row, the both of them squinting against the low gold light of an autumn morning that smelled of ripe fruit and warm wax. Crane was coming. Everyone on the bench knew it. Josiah Fenn's buggy had been seen turning off the county road just after sunup, and behind it, unhurried and certain, came Silas Crane's fine black rig with the brass lamps, the man himself sitting straight-backed under his good hat as though he were riding to his own coronation instead of to a foreclosure he believed already won. Winnie set the super down on the extracting bench Thomas had built her from Orchard Windfall lumber, and she wiped her hands slow on her apron, feeling the old wax stains under her fingers like the grain of familiar wood. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little, standing there, but it was true. A body could only be afraid of a thing it did not understand, and she understood this now, all of it, top to bottom, the way she understood a hive by the pitch of its hum. She had read the land, and the land had told her everything. They gathered in the dooryard, the honest half of the valley she had quietly asked to come. Aunt Marta stood square in her Sunday gray, with her arms folded like a fence rail. Reverend Price turned his hat in his hands. Old Dr. Holloway leaned on his stick with his black bag at his feet, and beside him, pale and thin but upright, stood Boyd Teller, who had not run after all. Nella clung to Winnie's skirt, then, catching herself, let go and stood on her own 2 feet the way Winnie had taught her to stand among the bees, still, steady, unafraid. Crane climbed down from his rig with the smile already fixed on his face, the wide, easy smile that never once reached his eyes. "Reeve," he said warmly, as though greeting a friend at church, "I'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. A hard season. A hard place. No shame in a man knowing when he's beaten." He drew a folded paper from his coat and held it out toward Fenn without looking at it, the way a man hands off a thing he considers already done. "The note's due today." "I don't believe it's been met." "It hasn't," Thomas said quietly. He did not reach for the paper. He looked, instead, at Winnie. "Then I'm sorry for you," Crane said, and he even managed to sound it. "Mr. Fenn, before you file that," Winnie said, and her plain, slow voice carried across the dooryard easy as a hymn, "I expect the county ought to hear how the note came to be unpayable in the first place, seeing as it didn't happen by God's own weather." Crane's smile held, but something behind it went flat and watchful, the look of a man who hears a board creak in a house he thought empty. "The Beekeeper," he said, and made the word sound like a small joke. "The woman they hired when no man would take the work." "That's me," Winnie agreed. "Too soft for hard work," they told me in town. Laughed, some of them. She let that sit a moment. "I've been called worse and stung harder." "Miss Fenn, you're an honest man, or so I'm given to understand, so I'll give you honest things and let you weigh them." Doctor? Dr. Holloway bent and drew from his black bag a row of small, stoppered bottles, cloudy with the water she'd sampled, and set them one by one on the porch rail where the morning light struck them. "This is water from Cold Spring above the bench," he said, in the dry courtroom voice of a man who had testified before. "Clean, and this is water taken from the flume below the Crane fence line 3 separate nights running." He held one bottle to the light, and even at a distance a body could see the faint oily sheen riding the top of it. "There's a compound in it, sugar of lead, sweet to the taste, deadly to a bee and no friend to a man. I've tested it. I'll swear to it before any court you please. Bees are careful drinkers," Winnie said, "but they're greedy for sweetness, and a poison that tastes like nectar will pull them right to their own dying. Somebody knew that. Somebody counted on it." Crane laughed, but it came out a half-beat too late. Any man's water might foul. A dead animal in a creek. It wasn't in the creek, Winnie said. It was on the Blossom. Painted on, downslope, on the rows nearest your line and no others. She turned to the gathered valley, and her voice never rose, never sharpened, only laid the thing out plain the way she'd lay calm on a table. A bee flies out from her hive, and she flies a straight road to the sweetest thing she can find, and she flies it home again, and every bee in the box learns that road from her. A beeline, folks call it, straightest thing in nature. I marked my foragers with a dab of paint, took me the better part of 3 days on my knees, and I watched where the sick ones came from. They didn't come from the orchard. They came up the slope, from the crane bloom, dragging poison home to feed the young. The bees drew me the map themselves. All I did was read it. She reached into her apron and set upon the rail, beside the doctor's bottles, a battered tin pail with a wire handle. "Boyd left this at the flume the night of the raid," she said, "along with his boot prints in the mud which match the boots he's standing in. There's poison dried in the bottom of it yet. And the sweet poison itself, sugar of lead, you'll find it on your own mercantile shelf, Mr. Crane, sold for glazing pottery, 3 tins short of what your own ledger says you ought to have." She looked at him then, mild as milk. "I read a ledger near as well as I read a hive. Yours doesn't balance." The dooryard had gone very still. Even the hives behind them seemed to hush, though a body knew that was only fancy. "Boyd," Winnie said gently, not turning. "You want to tell it, or shall I?" Boyd Teller stepped forward. His hands shook, and his face was gray, but he'd made his peace somewhere in the long night, and he looked Fenn dead in the eye when he spoke. "I did it," he said. "God help me, I did it. Crane held my brother's debt over me, said he'd see us both in the poorhouse. He paid me to foul the spring and salt the bloom and knock the hives over that night. I never meant the child to." His voice cracked and he stopped, and started again, lower. "He's been underpaying Reeve for the honey 2 years running and telling the valley it was fouled so no one else would bid on it. It was never fouled. It was the finest comb on the bench, and he knew it. He wanted the man broke. He wanted the spring." "The spring," Fenn said slowly, and for the first time he looked up from the paper in his hand and truly looked at Silas Crane. "Cold Spring never fails," Aunt Marta put in, plain and hard. "Not in the drought year of '71. Not ever. Every other water right on this bench has gone dry or gone to Crane, bought cheap off folks he'd first ruined, same as he tried to ruin Thomas. That spring's worth more than all the honey in Oregon in a dry country, and there's not a soul here doesn't know it." She unfolded a paper of her own, creased soft with handling. "I've got the names. Widow Sennett, the Ackleys, Old Man Dorr. All of them squeezed dry and bought out, all of them water-rich land, all of it flowing to one man. I've been keeping this list 2 years, waiting on somebody with the sand to stand up and use it." Fenn took her paper. He read it. The morning was quiet enough that a body could hear the paper crackle in his hands and beyond. The low-working hum of the hives Winnie had brought back from the dead. "Josiah," Crane said, and his voice had changed now, the warmth gone out of it, the ease gone brittle. You're not going to stand there and take the word of a hired woman and a debtor over a man you've known 20 years. No, Fenn said. I'm going to take the word of the water, and the doctor's bottles, and my own 2 eyes on your own ledger. He folded the foreclosure paper the wrong way, deliberate, creasing it backward, and put it in his coat where Crane could not reach it. You told me this land was failing, Silas. You told me it was a mercy. I signed my name to things because I believed you. A man's water rights don't come clean when they're built on ruining his neighbors, and I'll be spending the winter finding out just how many of these deeds unwind. He looked at Crane the way a man looks at a rotted beam he'd been calling sound. I was never bought. You only assumed I was. That was always your trouble. You thought every man had your price. Crane's smooth mask broke then, all at once, the way ice goes off a pond. One long crack, and then the whole face of it gone to dark water underneath. He looked around the dooryard for one friend and found none, not the Reverend, whose mild eyes had gone stony, not Marta, not Fenn, not even Boyd, who would not look away from him now. He drew himself up to say something, some last smooth thing, and found there was nothing smooth left to say. You'll regret this, he managed. No, Thomas said. It was near the first word he'd spoken, and it landed the heavier for it. I've done my regretting. 2 years of it. I'm through. He stepped to Winnie's side, not touching her, only standing there, and somehow that was answer enough. Get off my land, Silas, while the ground's still yours to walk off of. Crane went. There was nothing else for him to do. He climbed back into his fine black rig and took up the lines, and the brass lamps caught the sun as he turned, and that was the last the bench saw of the smile that never reached his eyes. Within the month the story would be all through the county, the fouled water rights unraveling one after another. The ruined neighbors coming forward once they saw a man could stand against him and win, the mercantile's crooked ledgers laid open. Crane would leave the valley before the first snow. Not in triumph, but in the quiet, friendless way of a man whose whole account has finally come due. Boyd Teller stayed. He paid his brother's debt honest, a little at a time, and Thomas, who knew something himself about a man deserving a second season, gave him work on the flume he'd once fouled, and in time the valley let him back among them. But all that was still to come. What the dooryard held, that gold autumn morning, once the black rig had gone small on the county road, was a long breath let go altogether, and then the plain ordinary business of a harvest that would not wait. For the harvest had come in true. That was the sweetest vindication of all, sweeter even than watching Crane's back. The rose Winnie had nursed hung heavy and hale, apples reddening on boughs that 2 seasons past had gone yellow at the edges and dropped their blossom early. And the honey was the answer to every lie Crane had told. She and Thomas drew frame after frame that week, the extractor whirling, the pale clean comb giving up its gold, filling every jar and crock and pail on the place, and then filling more they had to borrow. It ran clear as creek water held to the light, and it caught in the throat sweet and clover bright, without the least off taste, and any fool who'd been told the reeve honey was fouled had only to touch a finger to it to know he'd been sold a lie. Word travels. It travels fastest of all when there's money and a scandal both riding on it. The very buyers Crane had poisoned against the reeve name came up the bench road now, hats in hand, the packing house from town, the fine hotel down in the valley, a merchant clear from the coast who'd heard there was a clover honey on Clearwater bench worth the wagon trip. They bid against one another for it, the price climbing past anything Crane's crooked mercantile had ever paid. And Thomas stood in his own dooryard writing down orders on the back of the foreclosure paper Fenn had handed him for scrap, because it seemed a fitting thing to do. It cleared the note. And left over, enough to mend the barn roof and put by seed and see them warm through winter, and the deed to Reeves' Rest, the water rich. Spring-fed land that Silas Crane had schemed and poisoned and ruined men to get stayed exactly where it had always belonged, in the hand of a quiet man who'd near given up on it. The dying orchard had turned, at the last, into a genuinely sweet deal. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was true. The honey and the land and the spring, all secured, all sweet, all saved by the one thing nobody in town had counted worth a thing: a fat woman who could read bees. It was a week or so on, when the last of the crop was drawn, and the town buyers gone, and the place gone quiet in the way a place goes quiet after a hard good season, that Thomas found her out at the hives near dusk. She was doing what she always did at that hour, standing among the boxes with her veil off and pushed back, listening to the low, contented hum settle as the foragers came home, the sound of a hive that is full and queen-right and easy, the sound she loved best in all the world. "I've been meaning to say a thing," Thomas said, "and I've been no good at saying things for a long while. So bear with me." She waited, the way she'd wait on a hiv to tell her what it meant to do. She had learned that a man was not so different, given room. "When Ellen died, I let these bees go on purpose," he said. His voice was low and even, but she heard the cost under it. I told myself it was grief. But it was more like, if they died too, then the last of her would be gone, and I wouldn't have to keep failing her by keeping her things alive. I thought letting them go was letting her go. He looked at the humming boxes, and then at Winnie. "You told me that first week that bees don't grieve backward, that they build forward. I didn't believe you. I do now." "They do," Winnie said softly. "It's about the only thing they know how to do." "I don't want to offer you a season's wage," Thomas said. "A wage is for a stranger, and you're not that, and I'd be ashamed to name it. I've got no fine words and precious little that's smooth about me. But this is my home, and it's a home because you made it one, and I'd have you stay in it, not as help." As he stopped and started playing, which was the only way he had, as partner in the whole of it, the land, the bees, the work, and as my wife, if you'll have a quiet man who's been a fool and means to be less of one. Winnie was still a moment. The hum went on all around them, low and steady and full. Then that dry smile she had came up slow. "I've been underestimated in a good many places, Thomas Reeve," she said. "First time it's ever come out this well." She put her scarred, unflinching hand in his weathered one. "I'll stay. I was never much good at leaving anyhow, and there's 100 things on this bench still want doing right." That was all the courting either of them needed, and it was enough, and more than either had thought to have. There was a small tug at Winnie's apron. Nella had come up through the long grass without a sound, the way she'd learned, and she stood now among the boxes with the bees moving gold around her in the last light and not a flicker of fear in her thin, watchful face. She had spoken more this last month than in the whole 2 years before it, and every word came easier now, like water finding its old channel after the rocks are cleared away. "Are you going to stay for always?" the child asked. "For always," Winnie said. Nella considered this with the great seriousness of 9 years old. Then she reached up and took Winnie's other hand so that the three of them stood linked there in the humming dusk, and she said the thing plain, the way the whole family had a habit of saying things plain, the words she had been carrying and waiting to set down. "Then I'll call you Mama, if that's all right." Winnie's still calm face did not stay quite so calm then. Her pale hazel eyes went bright, and she had to look off toward the darkening orchard a moment before she could answer, and when she did her plain, slow voice was not quite steady. "That's all right," she said. "That's more than all right, sweetheart." The sun went down behind the ridge above Cold Spring, and the light lay gold and level across the bench, across the heavy-laden orchard and the mended flume and the rows of strong white boxes, and the bees came home in it. All of them, up their straight beelines to the hives that were alive and full, because a woman the whole valley had called too soft for hard work had knelt barehanded in the tall grass and heard, under all that broken humming, a thing worth saving. She stood there now with her veil off and her family beside her, the widower's hand in one of hers and the child's in the other, and the low contented sound of a healthy apiary rose up all around them, like the place itself breathing easy at last. Winifred Ottersby had been laughed at in every town that ever saw her coming. She had read weather and soil and blossom and the temper of bees the way other folk read print, and nobody had thought it worth a thing. And here, on Clearwater Bench above Cold Spring, on a homestead called Reeves' Rest that a smiling man had tried his best to steal, the reading had saved the bees and the land and the water, had caught the thief and cleared the good name and brought in the sweetest harvest the valley had ever tasted, and had won her, at the long last of it, the one thing she had never once been able to read her way to. A place to belong. A home. The soft, underestimated woman come all the way home at last in the humming gold of a season that was finally, truly her own.